I've told you that I believe the NCAA is effectively a broken organization. But one of the big topics, and I'm old man here, I don't know how many of you can see this if I zoom in or if I tilt this the right way. This is the weekend edition of the Wall Street Journal. And the headline, some of you may have seen when I shared this, is Caitlin Clark bigger than the men's tournament? That's the headline. And then there's another story. This is from today in the New York Times, and it says stars align for an ascendant game. Big picture of Caitlin Clark. And look, I give credit to Caitlin Clark. A lot of people are watching her. A lot of people care about her. But what I don't like is when I see sports media not using opinion, because opinions are fine. As my mom always used to say, opinions are like butts. Everybody's got one. I'm going to give you a ton of opinions all day long, every day. Some of them you're going to be like, you know what, Clay, you're right about this. Others of them you're going to be like, I hate you. I can't stand that opinion. That's life. But when I read things that are indisputably false in the media, I look and I say, I think it has to be called out. And so there are a couple of things here. I'm reading directly from the Wall Street Journal. First of all, let me say this. The NCAA tournament dwarfs for men the NCAA tournament for women. This is an indisputable fact. Tens of millions of more people will watch the NCAA men's tournament than the women's tournament. This is an indisputable truth. It always has been that way. I believe it always will be that way. Men are bigger, stronger, and faster. That makes men's basketball more fun to watch to most people than women's basketball at all levels. That's why the NBA players make $50 million a year and the WNBA players make $50,000 a year. It's because the men's game is far more exciting and the men are bigger, stronger, and faster. So when I read things like this from the Wall Street Journal, again, this was over the weekend, heading into Selection Sunday, I'm reading directly from the Wall Street Journal. It's become all but impossible to deny that for the first time ever, the women's tournament is shaping up to be a bigger deal than the men's. This is false. What would be a bigger deal? The event that tens of millions of more people watch, or the event that tens of millions of fewer people watch? This is a lie. I'm disappointed in the Wall Street Journal. They continue. It starts with the star power. The women's tournament indisputably has the biggest attraction in college sports in Iowa's Caitlin Clark. That is a lie. Caitlin Clark is a big women's college basketball star. She is nowhere near as big as lots of college football stars. Way more people watch college football every year than college basketball, period. It's not even comparable, the number of people that watch college football compared to college basketball. This is a falsehood that the Wall Street Journal is putting in their article. The notion that the I'm reading directly from their article. The notion that the men's NCAA tournament, long the crown jewel of college sports, would ever get overshadowed by the women's event would have been completely unthinkable just a few years ago. Again, they start with a false premise that the women's tournament is bigger than the men's tournament. They then argue that Caitlin Clark is the biggest star in college athletics, which is not remotely true. Caleb Williams, kind of a big deal. Drake May, kind of a big deal, right? Jalen Milroe, kind of a big deal. Quinn Ewers, kind of a big deal. There are tons of college football players either about to be drafted into the NFL or returning next year that are infinitely bigger than Caitlin Clark. So they start with a premise that is untrue. They then layer multiple untruths, and these are not opinions. These are things that are put forward as truths. They then say that the women's tournament's going to be bigger, and they continue. The women's hoops is so great, the hype is, says the Wall Street Journal, that it's entirely plausible this year's championships game could be the first to outdraw the men's final. That is not likely to happen, okay? Last year, Caitlin Clark was in the final. 9.9 million people watched. 14.7 million, according to the Wall Street Journal, watched UConn San Diego State. The smallest audience, they say, in March Madness history in this article. Nobody cared about UConn and San Diego State, and it still outdrew Caitlin Clark by 50%. Now, it's actually unlikely, I think, that Iowa's even going to make the championship, but it would be a tremendous upset if more people watch the women's NCAA tournament final than watch the men's final. But even if that were to end up happening, way more, tens of millions of more people are going to watch the men's tournament than watch the women's tournament. And tens of millions of more people are going to watch and fill out their NCAA tournament brackets for men than fill out the NCAA tournament for women's. Now, it is true that the rig job is kind of in effect here because the men's NCAA tournament final is going to be on TBS. And the women's NCAA tournament final is going to be on ABC. And the women's final will air on Sunday, and the men's final will air on Monday night. So if Iowa had Caitlin Clark and they're going up against, I don't know, South Carolina, is that even possible? Let me check. I'm going to be honest with you. I haven't even looked at the women's bracket yet. So I don't even know. Did they put South Carolina on the opposite side? South Carolina here. Iowa is not unintelligently. They put Iowa on the other side of the bracket. So in theory, Iowa and South Carolina could meet in the title game, which is what the NCAA tournament would want because South Carolina hasn't lost this year and Iowa is 29-4. So that would be their hope. They're trying to set that up to happen. But again, I'm not trying to take a shot at women's college basketball. I've watched, I bet, more women's college basketball historically than almost anybody has. My dad loved Pat Summitt and the Lady Vols. We had women's college basketball on in my house all the time because the Lady Vols and UConn was a huge story back in the day. Pat Summitt against Gino Auriemma was bigger, I think, than anything in women's college basketball right now. A lot of people cared. A lot of people care about Caitlin Clark. But when I see the Wall Street Journal writing this article, and then I see the New York Times the next day in their column saying, as we head into March Madness, it's the women's side of the tournament that is taking center stage. It's the women's stars who shine the brightest. It's the women's game with the most intriguing storylines. That's not even debatable. That's a lie. It's very debatable. Is Matt Painter going to choke with Purdue again? Pretty interesting story. Is UConn and Danny Hurley going to repeat? Interesting story. Is UNC going to battle back from not making the tournament last year to surge this year? Can Kelvin Sampson get revenge on the NCAA tournament and Houston win? Can Rick Barnes in Tennessee actually advance? Will Dalton Knecht be the best player? Is Zach Edey going to be the best player? What's going to happen with so many teams? Is Arizona any good in the last year of the Pac-12? There are a lot of storylines. Marquette, Kentucky. The men's tournament has a bevy of storylines. Can John Calipari get Kentucky back to winning? When I see things that are not true being described as not even debatable in both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, my antenna goes up and I say, this is not about sports at all. This is identity politics masquerading as sports. This is, we want to denigrate male athletics instead of treating it fairly and acknowledging, wait a minute, there's way more people who care about the NCAA tournament for men than women. It's not even comparable. It's probably 10-1. And when I see the arguments being made that it's indisputable that the women's game has more stars, I mean, the first couple of rounds of the women's NCAA tournament typically don't even have major upsets because there's such a huge gap between the quality of the women's teams, whereas a men's 16 seed could beat a men's 1 seed. 0% chance of that happening in the women's tournament. So the men's tournament is going to dwarf the women's tournament. And that's not a slight at Caitlin Clark. That's not an attack on women's athletics. But why is it that suddenly all major media outlets are trying to pretend that something that is not true is true? It's identity politics. This is important. People say, like, Clay, how did you see what was happening in America before other people did? How did OutKick get so big? It's because I saw identity politics coming through the prism of sports, where suddenly things that we have been doing for an entire generation, arguing like who's the best quarterback, who's the best player, who's the best coach, suddenly people on the left started coming for sports. And if you said, you know, I don't think Justin Fields is a very good quarterback, people are like, that's because you're racist and don't think black people can play quarterback. What? Nobody has thought that. I grew up with T. Martin winning a national championship for Tennessee. The first quarterback I remember watching play quarterback for Tennessee was Tony Robinson. He was a black guy, FYI. The first quarterback that the Tennessee Titans have had, and the best quarterback the Tennessee Titans have ever had, took the Titans to the Super Bowl. He was Steve McNair. In my home state of Tennessee, in 1998, T. Martin won a national championship, and in 1999, Steve McNair took the Titans to the Super Bowl. I don't know that I've ever heard anybody in my entire life argue that somebody couldn't succeed at quarterback because of their race. I legitimately, in my entire life as a sports fan, have never heard anyone that I know make that argument. Michael Vick went number 1 overall. Jamarcus Russell, I think I'm correct. Adam, make sure that I'm right about this. Jamarcus Russell went number 1 overall. Cam Newton went number 1 overall. Vince Young was the first quarterback taken in his draft, number 3 overall by the Titans, and I was cheering for it, unfortunately. Jameis Winston went number 1 overall. Bryce Young went number 1 overall. Anthony Richardson went 4th. C.J. Stroud went 2nd in the last draft. Nobody cares about the race of quarterbacks. I would support the Titans having a transgender midget at quarterback if he could win the AFC, he, she, whatever friggin' pronoun they want to use, could win the AFC South and actually take the Titans to the Super Bowl. There may be some trans midgets out there, frankly, who are better than Will Levis. All of these things prove that all the NFL cares about is winning, but it's identity politics that has divided all of us, right? They're trying to use identity politics with women's basketball here, too. Oh, men's basketball stinks now. Nobody watches it. What are you talking about? The NCAA tournament for men just set an all-time record for viewership like a year ago. I don't even think the Caitlin Clark era has been as highly rated as the UConn Tennessee women's era was like 20 years ago. Pay particular attention when media figures tell you that's not even debatable. The only thing in sports is debate in sports media. I mean, when somebody writes a paragraph in the New York Times like, as we head into March Madness, it's the women's side of the tournament taking center stage. It's the women's stars who shine the brightest. It's the women's game with the most intriguing storylines. That's not even debatable. Hashtag girl power, girl boss. No, it is debatable. It's not true. And when the Wall Street Journal tries to argue Caitlin Clark is bigger than the entire men's basketball tournament, are you kidding me? There will be dozens of NCAA tournament games that are higher watched than the most watched Caitlin Clark game. Nobody will watch, by and large, the early rounds of the NCAA women's tournament. It will be a pale shadow of the men's tournament. These are lies. And when you're being told lies, and you're being told lies by people who want to interject identity politics and say it's not even debatable, I think your eyebrows should go up and you should say, hey, what is the actual story here? So lies being spread. I'm disappointed in the Wall Street Journal because usually they're better than this. The New York Times spreads lies all the time. When they're doing it using sports as the prism, I think that's a big deal.